The alarm came at 300 hours ship time. Dr. Ethan Cole was already awake. He was always awake at odd hours, sitting at the small desk in his quarters aboard the HSV mending hand, reading alien anatomy files that most humans would find impossible to stand. He had a cup of cold coffee at his elbow and 3 open data pads in front of him. His hair was a mess. His uniform shirt was untucked. He looked like a man who had forgotten what sleep was supposed to feel like. When the alarm rang through the ship, he was already pulling on his boots. The mending hand was a joint medical vessel, part human, part veil Thari. It had been the result of 2 years of careful diplomatic work, a ship designed to show that the 2 species could cooperate. In practice, the cooperation was polite, cold. The veil theory medics worked on their side of the ship, the humans on theirs, and everyone was very careful to say the right things at the right times without actually meaning much of it. Ethan was the only human doctor on board. There were 6 others from Earth, 2 nurses, 2 lab technicians, 2 general staff. But Ethan was the surgeon, the specialist, the reason humanity had a seat at the table. He jogged down the corridor toward the bridge, nearly colliding with Commander Voss in the process. Voss was the lead Veil Thari medic. He was tall like all Veil Thari, nearly 7 feet, with pale silver skin and wide dark eyes that caught the light like mirrors. He dressed in perfectly pressed medical robes at all times, even at AO 300. He looked at Ethan the way professor looks at a student who keeps showing up to class in pajamas. A shuttle, Voss said without greeting. Disabled 3 km off the starboard side. They are transmitting medical emergency codes. What kind of shuttle? Ethan asked. Diplomatic class, Veil. The registry. Voss paused. Civilian passengers. How many injured? Unknown. The hull took a plasma conduit rupture. Internal systems are unstable. Voss was already moving. My team will handle it. Your presence is not required. Ethan followed him anyway. He did that a lot. The shuttle was in bad shape when the rescue pod brought the first passengers aboard the mending hand. Ethan counted 11 survivors, 4 of them on stretchers. The Veil Tharfi nurses moved fast, speaking quickly in their own language, setting up bioharmonic stabilizers, the alien equivalent of life support, which worked by reading and adjusting the body's natural energy frequency. It was elegant technology. Ethan had spent weeks trying to understand it. He stood at the edge of the bay watching. Voss had made it clear he was an observer at best. Then the last stretcher came in. The woman on it was young, or at least she looked young. By Veil the standards, her silver skin had gone almost white. Dark eyes were half open and unfocused. Her breathing was wrong. Ethan noticed it immediately. It wasn't shallow or fast. It was uneven, like a machine running on broken timing, catching and stuttering. He stepped closer before he even thought about it. One of the Velthari nurses moved to block him, then stopped when Voss raised a hand. Stand back, Doctor Cole. Voss said, we have her. Ethan watched as they placed the bioharmonic stabilizer on the woman's chest. The machine lit up, read her frequency, and then gave a flat, short tone. Voss frowned. He adjusted the settings, tried again, same tone. What does that mean? Ethan asked. Inference, Voss said. Plasma rupture. The radiation may have disrupted her bowfield. We will recalibrate. Ethan pulled out his own scanner. It was a simple human device, boxy and gray and very unelegant. Compared to the Veil 30 equipment, he ran it over the woman's torso. The readings made his stomach tighten. Clear his throat. She's not just disrupted, he said. She's in cascade. Organ failure. Secondary circulatory system is hemorrhaging internally. The plasma radiation triggered a reaction. He stopped, checked the readings. Again, to be sure, in her tertiary liver. It's pushing toxins back into her primary bloodstream. That's why your stabilizer isn't working. Her biorequency isn't disrupted. It's being actively overridden by the toxin buildup. Voss looked at him. That is not possible. Cascade organ failure of that type requires a very specific kind of plasma radiation exposure. Yes, Ethan lowered his scanner. I wrote a paper on cross-species radiation pathology 8 months ago. I know what this looks like. The room was quiet. The woman's breathing stuttered again. You wrote a paper? Voss repeated very slowly. She has maybe 40 minutes, Ethan said. Probably less. Voss turned back to his team. He tried 2 more things with the stabilizer, then a third. Each time the machine gave that same flat, short tone. Around the bay, the other injured passengers were being treated with smooth efficiency. This one. The Veiler technology could not reach. Ethan waited. He gave Voss the time. He understood that this was not his ship, his team, not his patient according to anyone's rules, but he was watching a person die. After 7 minutes he spoke. Again, I can fix it, he said, but not with your equipment. Voss turned. Excuse me, your bioharmonic stabilizer can't get past the toxin interference. If we use it differently, not as a primary tool, but as a support system to hold her secondary circulatory pressure steady, then I can go in manually and isolate the Cherary liver bleed. Stop at the source. Once the bleed stops, the toxin flood slows. Own body can start processing the backlog. A long silence. Go in manually, Voss said. Surgery? Ethan said. Yes. The look on Voss's face was something between disbelief and offense. Among the Veil Thari surgery, actually opening a body was considered last resort, used only in the most primitive circumstances. Their medicine worked with the body's own systems. The idea of cutting into living tissue was, to them, roughly equivalent to a human doctor suggesting they try hitting a patient with a stick. You want to cut? Sorry. Voss said, I want to save her. Ethan said, cutting is how I do that. She is a Veiler national, a civilian under our care. I will not allow a human to. Then she dies, Ethan said, not harshly, just clearly. Your stabilizer has failed 3 times. You have no other tools that can reach through the toxin interference. I do. My tools are simple. Yes, old-fashioned, yes, but they work on biology, not on biorequency. The toxins can't block a scalpel. Voss stared at him. The woman's monitor gave a sharp, urgent sound. 32 minutes left. Maybe. Voss stepped back. He didn't say yes. He didn't say anything. He simply moved aside and looked at the wall. And Ethan understood that this was the closest thing to permission he was going to get. He called for his medical kit. From his quarters, a nurse ran for it. He scrubbed his hands at the basin. The corner, he pulled on gloves. He asked 2 of the Veil Theory nurses to assist him, speaking slowly and clearly. Because their translator implants had a half-second delay, and in surgery half a second matters, they looked at Voss. He gave them a small stiff nod. They helped. Ethan worked fast. He had operated in worse conditions in field tents on Earth, on a moving transport, during a storm, once in a power outage, with a flashlight held by a trainee. The Mending Hands medical bay was positively luxurious by comparison. He found the bleed in the tertiary liver in under 4 minutes, isolated it, closed it. Then he waited, watching the monitors. Toxin levels in her bloodstream began slowly, then faster to fall. Her biofrequency, finally unblocked, began to stabilize on its own. The bioharmonic stabilizer, which Voss quietly switched back on, accepted her signal this time. The machine's tone changed from flat and short to a long, smooth hum. Her breathing evened out. Ethan stepped back from the table and stripped off his gloves. His hands were steady. They were always steady during the work. It was only after sometimes that they shook a little. The bay was silent. Every vial 3 in the room was staring at him, at the woman on the table, at the very simple, very old-fashioned instruments laid out on the tray beside her. Voss had not moved from the wall. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were on the monitor, on the steady climbing numbers, and something in his face had changed. Something had gone out of it. The certainty, maybe she'll need rest, Ethan said, and someone should flush her secondary system with a diluted bioharmonic pulse every 6 hours for the next 2 days, just to help the process along. He paused. I can write that up if you need. Nobody answered. Ethan picked up his scanner from the tray and walked out of the bay. In the corridor, alone, he leaned against the wall for a moment, closed his eyes, breathed. He didn't know who she was. He hadn't asked. It hadn't seemed like the important question. The important question had been whether she would live. She would. That was enough. He pushed off the wall and went back to his quarters to finish his cold coffee. There were still 2 anatomy files he hadn't read yet. 3 hours later, Villari aide knocked on his door with a pale face and wide, frightened eyes. Dr. Cole, the aide said, the woman you treated, we have just confirmed her identity. Ethan looked up from his data pad. Okay, she is Seraphael Velvar. The aide paused, as if waiting for the name to land. The Emperor's daughter, the Imperial Princess. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then he looked back at his data pad. Good, he said. Then she has people who will make sure she follows the recovery instructions. The aide stared at him. Ethan turned to Paige. The Imperial ship arrived at the Mending Hands 6 hours later. Ethan was in the middle of changing the bandages on a Vale Thari crew member's arm when the announcement came over the ship's speakers. He didn't understand all of it. His Vale Thari was functional but not perfect, but he caught the important parts. Imperial vessel docking, all senior staff to the main bay. The crew member whose arm he was wrapping gave him a look that was hard to read. Is that normal? Ethan asked, nodding toward the speaker. No, the crew member said quietly, that is never normal. The Imperial ship was 3 times the size of the Mending Hand. It docked with a mountain settling. When the doors opened, 12 armored Vale Thari guards walked out in 2 perfect lines, and between them came a man who didn't need the guards to make a room. Pay attention, him, Emperor Valethos the Undying was old, not old the way a tired person looks old, old the way a stone cliff looks old, carved by time into something harder and more permanent than It had started out, he was taller than most Vale Thari, which meant he was nearly 8 feet, and he moved slowly but with absolute certainty, the way things move when they have never been in a hurry because the world waits for them. His eyes found Ethan immediately. Ethan stood at the back of the assembled staff, still in his working uniform, still with a small smear of antiseptic on his left sleeve. Around him the snort's veiler crew had straightened into stiff formal postures. The human staff looked at each other nervously. The Emperor stopped in the center of the bay. He looked at Ethan for a long moment without speaking. Then he spoke in Velari, and a translator standing at his shoulder repeated it in flat, careful English. "You are the one called Ethan Cole?" "Yes," Ethan said. "You operated on my daughter." "I did, without permission, without rank, without invitation." Ethan held the Emperor's gaze. "Commander Voss's equipment wasn't working. She was dying. I had a way to help, so I helped." Another silence. The translator murmured. The Emperor and LT Unk and GT's expression did not change. "She is alive," the Emperor said. "Yes, because of you." Ethan didn't answer that. It felt like the kind of statement that didn't need an answer. The Emperor turned slightly and said something to the translator that was longer and more formal. The translator straightened, cleared his throat, and spoke. "By the law of the Velcroth Accord, which has governed the Vale Thari people for 10,000 years, any person who preserves the life of one of imperial blood is named Anarathi, soul bonded protector. This title carries full elevation above all non-royals. It cannot be refused. It cannot be undone." The translator paused. "Furthermore, under the Accord's highest tradition, the tradition of Velshara, the binding of lives, the one who was saved is to be joined to the one who saved them in recognition that their life now belongs in part to their rescuer. This joining is to be honored as a union between houses." The bay was completely silent. Ethan stared at the translator. "I'm sorry, can you say the last part again?" The translator said it again. Ethan turned back to the Emperor. "You're giving me your daughter," the translator murmured. The Emperor replied, "The tradition does not frame it as giving." The translator said carefully, "It frames it as the recognition of a bond that already exists. The princess's life is tied to yours. The Accord says this bond must be honored openly." "I'm a human," Ethan said. The translator spoke. The Emperor replied again very simply, "The Accord does not specify species." Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, "I don't want a princess. I'm a doctor. I fixed what was broken. That's the job. That's all it was." The Emperor looked at him. For a long moment, something moved in those ancient eyes. Not anger, something more complicated. "I know," the treasurer said after the Emperor spoke quietly. "That is precisely why the Accord applies." They gave Ethan a suite of rooms on the Imperial ship that was bigger than his entire apartment back in Edinburgh. The ceilings were high. The walls were some kind of smooth, pale stone that glowed faintly at night. SHH. And there were plants growing along the window sill that he didn't recognize and was slightly afraid to touch. He sat on the edge of the bed and called Mira Solace. Mira was his oldest colleague, still back on Earth at the university hospital where they had both trained. She had a sharp face, a sharper sense of humor, and absolutely no patience for self-pity or drama. She was the right person to call. She answered on the Third ring took one look at his face on the screen and said, "What did you do?" "I saved someone's life," Ethan said. "That sounds like something you would do. Why do you look like that?" She was the alien emperor's daughter. Mira was quiet for a second. "Okay, and apparently there's a 10,000-year-old law that says I have to marry her now." Longer silence. "Say that again," he said. "It again." Mira put her hand over her face. He could hear her breathing through it. Then she lowered her hand and said very evenly, "Ethan, my love, dear friend, only you could go on a medical exchange program and come back engaged to alien royalty. I'm not engaged. I don't know what I am. What does the princess think? I haven't spoken to her yet. She's still recovering, right?" Mira thought for a moment. "Can you refuse the law? The emperor says no. Can you appeal it?" "I don't think there's an appeal process when the emperor is the one enforcing." Mira nodded slowly. "And is she, is the princess, she's alive?" Ethan said, "which is the only part I was trying to achieve." Mira almost smiled. "Well, you were always very focused on outcomes." She leaned forward. "Listen to me. You're a grown man on a foreign world dealing with a situation that has no rule book. Just do what you always do." "What do I always do?" "You pay attention," Mira said. "You don't panic. And you don't make any assumptions about the patient before you actually know what they need." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Right." "He said good." She pointed at him. "And Ethan, tuck in your shirt before you meet the emperor again." He met Sarafael Velver the next morning. She was sitting up in the medical bay of the imperial ship, which was nothing like the clean, bright medical bays Ethan was used to. Everything in it was bioluminescent and soft, the equipment built into the walls like living things. She was dressed in white and looked not fragile exactly, but carefully put back together, the way a person looks when they are still sore but will not let that show. She was also, Ethan noticed, watching the door when he walked in, as if she had been waiting. He stopped a respectful distance from her. "Princess, I'm Dr. Cole. I wanted to check on your recovery." "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was low and clear. Her English was perfect, better than his veil. "Thari, certainly everyone knows who you are. The human who cut into me with a blade and somehow kept me alive. Your tertiary liver was bleeding into your primary bloodstream," he said. "The bioharmonic equipment couldn't reach it through the toxin buildup. Manual liation was the only option that would work." She looked at him steadily. "I am not criticizing the method. I am alive. I am aware of what that means. You don't have to be grateful." Ethan said it was the job. Something shifted in her expression. "A small thing to name. My father has told you about the Velkrath Accord," she said. "Yes, and you are unhappy about it." He paused, choosing words carefully. "I'm concerned that a 10,000-year-old law is being applied to a situation it was never designed for, and I'm concerned about what you think about it, because nobody has mentioned that part." She was quiet for a moment, really quiet, not the polite kind, but the kind that means something is being considered. "I think," she said finally, "that I have spent my whole life being guided by what the Accord requires and what tradition demands and what the Empire needs from me." Voice was even not angry, just truthful. "And I think that I do not wish this any more than you do." "Okay," Ethan said. "If we must be bound by law," she continued, "then know this clearly. I will not be managed, I will not be handled, I will not be treated as something fragile or simple or less than what I am. Ethan met her eyes. Dark as deep water, absolutely serious. Good, he said. Neither will I. She studied him for a moment, whatever she was looking for. She seemed to find enough of it to continue. Sit down, Dr. Cole, she said, and tell me exactly what you did to keep me alive. I want to understand it, all of it. He pulled up a chair, and for the next hour, in a soft glowing room on an imperial ship crossing the stars, a human doctor explained surgery to an alien princess, and she asked sharp, intelligent questions at every step and corrected two of his veil's medical terms and did not look away once. By the end, neither of them had resolved anything, but something had started, something neither of them had planned. The stars outside the window moved slowly past. Nobody noticed. Valor Prime was the kind of world that made a person feel small, not in a cruel way, just in the way that standing at the base of a mountain makes you feel small, because it is old and you are not, because it has been here long before you arrived and will remain long after you are gone. The capital city stretched across a valley of pale stone towers, rising like fingers reaching for the sky, every surface covered in soft, bioluminescent growth that pulsed gently in the dark like a sleeping heartbeat. At night, the whole city glowed. From the upper windows of the diplomatic quarter, it looked like the stars had come down and decided to stay. Ethan stood at one of those windows on his first morning on Valthar Prime and thought that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Then he went to find somewhere to set up a clinic. Nobody asked him to do it. That was the thing people would talk about later when they told the story. No one assigned him the task, no one suggested it. Ambassador Cheney, Earth's diplomat on Valthar Prime, had pulled Ethan aside on the first day and explained very carefully that his role here was ceremonial for now. Attend the formal events, be polite, do not do anything that could be interpreted as politically aggressive. Ethan had nodded and said he understood. Then he had found an empty room in the lower level of the diplomatic quarter, cleaned it out himself, and begun seeing patients spread the way word always spreads in a city, quietly at first, then all at once. There were Valthari citizens who had conditions their own medicine had marked as untreatable, not dangerous, not urgent, but chronic, persistent, the kind of small suffering that a person learns to carry because there is no other option. Joint problems, circulation issues, curring nerve condition in the outer districts that the bioharmonic healers had never been able to fully address. Ethan could not fix everything. He was very clear about that with every patient, but he could fix some things, and the things he could fix, he fixed with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had decided that every problem in front of him deserved his full effort, no matter how small. Within 2 weeks, the room was not big enough. Within 3, the Valthari were calling him the healing stranger. It was not an official title. It was not granted by the emperor or the court. It came from the people in the outer districts who had been waiting a long time for someone to pay attention to the things that hurt them. Ethan did not know about the name for several days. When Sarafel told him, he was quiet for a moment. Is that a problem? He asked. She looked at him from across the small table where they were having what had become a regular morning Meeting, not romantic, not ceremonial. Just practical, they had both decided early that if this situation was going to exist, they would at least make it functional. They talked every morning about the city, about the court, about what each of them needed to know. It is not a problem for the people, she said. It is a problem for Chancellor Draven. Sure, High Chancellor Draven had not liked the arrangement from the beginning. He was a careful political man who had spent 40 years managing the space between the Emperor's will and the court's comfort, and he was very good at it. He dressed in dark, formal robes at all times. He spoke in measured, precise sentences. He smiled rarely, and when he did, it never reached his eyes. He visited Ethan formally on the 19th day. He sat across from Ethan in a reception room with a cup of veal Thari tea that he did not drink, and said very pleasantly that he had concerns about the legal application of the Velcroth Accord to a non-Veil Thari individual, and that he had filed a formal challenge with the Imperial Council requesting a review. Ethan listened politely. The accord has never been applied across species lines. Draven said its language refers to Valithari persons. You are not Veil Thari. The argument is straightforward. I understand, Ethan said. What happens if the council agrees with you? Draven smiled. The bond is annulled. You are returned to your medical exchange position. Everything goes back to what it was. Ethan thought about that. He thought about Seraphil and her sharp questions and the way she had corrected his Veil Thari medical terminology without making him feel stupid about it. He thought about the patients in his clinic and the name they had given him without being asked, and the princess. He said, what happens to her? A small pause. She returns to her previous standing. Of course, previous standing, where someone else decides who she's bonded to. Draven's smile did not waver. The accord would no longer apply. Other traditions would govern. Other traditions, Ethan repeated. Owns. She gets less safe, I assume. The smile finally faded just slightly. CC came here to inform you professionally, Dr. Cole, not to debate the matter, right? Ethan said, thank you for coming. He showed Draven out and then sat alone in the reception room for a while thinking. Prince Darren Velvar came 3 days later, and he did not bother with pleasantries. He was built differently from the Emperor, not as tall, broader through the shoulders, but the kind of physical confidence that came from a lifetime of formal combat training. He was the heir to the throne and clears throat. He looked like it. He walked into the room like he owned it, which technically he did. He looked at Ethan the way a person looks at something they have found in a place it should not be. My sister, he said, is not a reward. I know that. Ethan said, she is not a prize for performing a medical procedure. I agree completely. Darren paused. He had clearly prepared for more resistance. You agree? Yes, I didn't save her life to get anything from it. I saved her life because she was dying and I knew how to stop it. That's the whole story. Ethan met the prince's eyes steadily. If there were a way to honor what I did without involving your sister at all, I'd prefer it. Darren studied him for a long moment, then step aside. Fuse the accord. Let Draven's challenge stand. What happens to her if I do? Silence. Darren did not answer, which was itself an answer, right? Ethan said quietly. Darren turned away and looked at the window for a moment. When he turned back, something in his posture had shifted, not softened exactly, but Changed, there is a way, he said slowly, to settle the question of your worth. Draven's legal challenge, something. Older, the Anchar, Ethan said. Darren and LT Unk and GT's eyes narrowed. You know of it? I've been reading, Ethan shrugged. I read a lot. The Anchar was a trial. Ancient, formal, designed to determine whether a person was worthy of standing beside someone of imperial blood. It was traditionally a combat trial. Challenger chose the form, the subject endured it, and the court decided. Darren chose combat. Ethan, when informed of the form, quiet for a very long moment. Then he said, I'd like to invoke the alternate clause. Darren blinked. What? Section 12 of the Anchar Codex. The alternate clause, it states that if the subject of the trial believes the chosen form does not reflect the nature of their bond to the imperial house, they may propose a different form. Court decides if the alternate is accepted. Ethan paused. I read the Codex last week, all of it. Darren stared at him. I'd like to propose a trial of knowledge and endurance. Ethan said specifically a medical trial. I will treat a series of cases that your medical counsel presents using only my own tools and knowledge within time limits they set, judged by results. That is not the Anchar, Darren said. Section 12 says it can be, Ethan said calmly. If the court agrees. The court agreed. Barely after 2 days of debate that Ethan was not invited to attend. The trial happened in a large formal hall with the Imperial Council watching from elevated seats. Draven sat among them with his arms folded. Darren stood at the side of the room, expressionless. Seraphil was not supposed to be there. She was there anyway, standing at the back, and when Ethan walked past her on the way to the trial table, he did not acknowledge her, because he had learned enough about Vale Thyri court protocol to know that acknowledging her would cause a problem. But he saw her, and she gave him a very small, very careful nod. He nodded back. Then he sat down and got to work. The medical council presented 7 cases. Over 4 hours, 3 were straightforward, 2 were difficult. 1 was the nerve condition from the outer districts that no one had been able to solve, presented as a theoretical. Here are the readings, here is the history. What do you do? Ethan worked through it, step by step, out loud, explaining every decision, not performing, just thinking the way he always thought, methodically, without rushing, without pretending. Certainty he didn't have. The 7th case was a trick, a set of readings that looked like one thing but were actually another, a deliberate misdirection to see if he would chase the obvious answer. He didn't. He sat with it for 3 quiet minutes, then calmly explained why the obvious answer was wrong and what the correct one was. When it was done, the hall was quiet. The council conferred. It took less time than Ethan expected. They ruled in his favor. Draven sat very still. Darren stood at the side of the room and looked at Ethan across the space between them. His face was unreadable. Then slowly he lowered his head, a small bow, just a fraction, just enough. It was the first time Ethan would learn later that Darren Velvar had bowed to anyone outside his own family. Ethan walked out of the hall and found Seraphil waiting in the corridor. 7 cases, she said. 7 cases, he agreed. You knew about the 7th one. I suspected the symptom pattern was too clean. Real cases are messier. She looked at him for a moment. In the soft light of the corridor, with the bioluminescent walls glowing gently around them, She looked less like a princess and more like a person, tired, thoughtful, carrying something heavy and carrying it carefully. You did not have to do any of this, she said. You could have let Draven's challenge stand. You could have gone home. I could have. Ethan said, why didn't you? He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything, because going home would have left things broken, he said. Finally, and I'm not good at leaving broken things alone. She was quiet for a long moment. No, she said softly, don't. Suppose you are. They walked back through the glowing corridor side by side, not touching, not speaking, the city humming its quiet bioluminescent hum all around them. Neither of them had planned any of this. Somewhere between a dying shuttle and a trial in a formal hall, something had shifted between them, slow and quiet and not yet named. The way important things often begin. The stars outside the windows of Vale Prime shone steadily. They always did. The message came on a Tuesday. Ethan had started marking the days by Earth's calendar because it kept him grounded. Vale the Prime had its own time system. Longer days, shorter months, a calendar built around the movement of 3 moons, and while he was learning it, he still thought in Tuesdays and Thursdays, in the simple rhythm of a week that he had carried since childhood. It was a Tuesday when Ambassador Cheney knocked on his door with a face like a fist. There is an outbreak, Chen said. Border colony. Designation KTH-7. It started 4 days ago. And it's moving fast. Ethan was already standing. What kind of outbreak? That's the problem. Chen came inside and closed the door behind him. The Vale Terry mechanical teams can't then identify it. Their bioharmonic scanners are reading the pathogen but not classifying it. The cellular structure doesn't match anything in their database. He paused. It matches something in ours. Ethan went. Still, it's a human pathogen, said quietly, mutated, probably carried to the colony by a trade crew 6 weeks ago. Jumped species and mutated during the process. The Vale 3 immune system has no baseline defense against it. On Earth, it would cause a mild respiratory infection, clears throat. Here he stopped. Here it's killing people. Ethan said. 31 dead in 4 days, over 200 infected. The colony has 12,000 residents. Ethan was already moving to his supply cabinet. The Shadow Compact moved faster than the medical team. By the time Ethan had his kit packed and was requesting transport clearance, someone had already leaked the information to the Compact's networks. The broadcast was running across Verilari communication channels, not a news report, not a factual account. Something shaped and sharp and aimed like a weapon. The healing stranger brings death wrapped in mercy. The human pathogen spreads through the colony he was meant to protect. This is what comes of mixing old blood with new. Ethan saw the broadcast on a screen in the transport bay. He watched it for 30 seconds, then turned away and finished checking his equipment. He did not have time for it. People were dying. What he did not know, what he would not learn until later, was that before leaving he had quietly handed a sealed report to Prince Darren. He had been gathering information for weeks, the way doctors gather information about a patient. Small observations, patterns, things that didn't quite fit. He had noticed irregularities in the Emperor's security rotation, gaps that looked like accidents but felt like design. He had written it all down and given it to Darren without explanation, just a simple Note, I don't know if this is anything, but I'd rather be wrong than not mention it. He left for Cath 7 and put it out. His mind, Dr. Una Park arrived from Earth 2 days into the outbreak. Response: she was small and fast-moving, and had the kind of energy that made rooms feel more organized just by her walking into them. She had trained Ethan during his residency and had spent the 15 years since building one of Earth's best infectious disease programs. She looked at the colony's medical situation in the first 3 hours, asked 47 precise questions, and by the end of the day had a containment framework sketched out that the Vilthari medical team, who had initially been reluctant to take shit from humans, were following without argument. You trained her, Seraphale said to Ethan, watching Una work from the doorway of the main medical tent. She trained me, Ethan corrected. Seraphale had arrived on the second day. She had not been given permission. She had simply gotten on a transport, and no one had stopped her because she was the Emperor and LT, Unk and GT's daughter, and stopping her would have required someone willing to physically stand in her way. And that person did not exist. Emperor had sent 2 messages asking her to return. She had replied to both of them with the same 3 words in formal Vilthari that translated roughly to I'm busy. Ethan had not asked her to come, but when she arrived he had shown her where the supply inventory was kept and explained the triage system without being asked. She had understood it in 10 minutes and been running part of it by the afternoon. She did not get in the way. She did not ask for special treatment. She worked alongside the nurses and the Vilthari aid workers with the same quiet focus she brought to everything. The colony's residents did not know who she was. She did not tell them. The nights were the hardest part. The pathogen spread fastest in the first 12 hours of infection, which meant the containment teams worked constantly, tracing contacts, testing residents, moving the infected to the quarantine ward before the virus had time to spread. Further, Ethan and Una split the shifts. He took the night hours because he slept badly anyway, and the night hours were when the hardest cases came in. On the 3rd night, Seraphale found him in the small supply room at the back of the medical tent, sitting on an overturned crate, eating something out of a container that had gone cold hours ago. She sat down across from him on another crate, which was not a dignified thing for a princess to do, and she did it without hesitation. How many tonight? She asked. 4 critical, 2 stable. He stopped. 1 we lost about an hour ago. Young, 18 maybe. The pathogen hit her respiratory system fast. We couldn't get ahead of it. Seraphale was quiet. Outside the tent, the colony hummed with the sounds of a contained crisis. Low voices, equipment, the distant sound of someone being moved on a stretcher. I'm sorry, she said. It happens. He said it plainly, not coldly. In medicine, people die despite your best efforts. You learn to carry it without letting it stop you, because stopping doesn't help the next one. She looked at him for a moment. How do you do that? Carry it? I mean, whether healers, when they lose someone, they grieve formally, is a ritual. It takes time. You don't seem to stop. I grieve later, he said, when there's room for it. He looked at his cold food. Grieve her later, when the work is done, and clears throat if the work is never done. He almost smiled. Then I grieve in the small spaces. At 3:00 a.m. cold food on a crate in a supply room. She looked at him for a long time. Why do You keep going, she asked, genuinely not challenging, wanting to know. You have already done enough, more than enough. No. One would question it if you stepped back. He looked up at her. Enough, he said simply, is not a word I know. She held his gaze. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, the way a tide shifts slow and complete and not going back. No, she said quietly, I don't think it is. By the sixth day, the containment was holding. Una had developed a treatment protocol using a combination of human antiviral compounds and Vilari bioharmonic support therapy, two medical systems that had never been designed to work together, now working together. It was imperfect and it required constant adjustment, and it was by any measure remarkable. The infection rate dropped, then dropped again. Critical ward began to empty faster than it filled. On the seventh day, Ethan stood outside the medical tent in the early morning light. KTH7 had a pale orange sun that came up, slowly spreading color across the colony's flat rooftops, and felt the specific exhaustion that comes not from failure but from effort, the good kind of tired, the kind that means something was done. Seraphale came to stand beside him. They stood there for a while, without speaking, watching the orange light move across the rooftops. It's going to be all right, he said, not a promise, an assessment. Yes, she agreed. Think it is. Back on Vailder Prime, Prince Darren had read Ethan's report. He had read it 3 times, then given it to the Imperial Guard's intelligence division, who had taken 12 hours to verify what Ethan had only suspected, that the security gaps were not accidental, that someone inside the palace had been creating them deliberately, and that the target was the Emperor himself. The assassination attempt came on the 5th night of the outbreak, when the Emperor was least guarded and the court's attention was elsewhere. It did not succeed because Darren had read the reports. Individuals responsible were taken quietly, without public announcement, in the way that palace security matters are handled when the Emperor wants them handled carefully. Draven's name was not among them. 2 of his closest aides were, and the Chancellor spent the following days very still and very quiet, like a man recalculating everything. Darren sent Ethan a message. It was short. Your report was useful. The matter is resolved. Ethan read it. In the colony's medical tent between patient rounds, he showed it to no one. He filed it away and went back to work. On the 8th day, the Shadow Compact broadcast their final move. It was a formal public challenge transmitted on the Empire's main communication network, addressed to the Imperial Council. It questioned the legitimacy of the Velcro Accord as applied to Ethan Cole. It called on the Council to hold a public hearing. It listed 14 legal arguments and attached signatures from 43 court officials. It was by Vailthari legal standards a serious document. It landed on Vailthar Prime while Ethan was elbow deep in patient care on KTH7 and completely unreachable for comment. Ambassador Cheney forwarded it to him with a message that said only, brace yourself. Ethan read it at 2:00 a.m. in the supply room over more cold food. He thought about it for a while, then he set down his food, picked up his scanner, and went back to the ward. There were still people who needed him. The legal documents could wait. The patients could not. On the morning of the 9th day, Seraphale watched him explain a recovery plan to an elderly Velos man who was frightened and kept asking the same question over and over. Ethan answered it the same way each time, patiently, clearly, without a trace of irritation. The third time he sat down so he was at the man's eye level and spoke a little slower. The man finally understood. His shoulders dropped with relief. Ethan moved on to the next patient. Sarafael stood in the doorway of the ward and watched him and thought about all the things she had believed about humans before she met one short-lived, primitive, loud, impulsive, a species that had barely touched the stars. She thought about what she believed now. She didn't have a word for it yet, but it was there, clear and solid as anything she had ever known, and it had been building for 9 days on this colony, or perhaps longer, perhaps since a glowing corridor unveiled her prime or a small supply room at 3:00 a.m. or a morning meeting at a table where 2 people who had not planned any of this decided to make it work anyway. She pushed off the door frame and went back to the supply inventory. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, and somehow standing beside this man that felt less like a burden and more like a reason. They came back from KTH-7 on a quiet ship, not a grand return, not a ceremony, just a transport vessel with tired crew and a medical team that smelled like antiseptic and had not slept properly in 9 days. Ethan sat in a seat near the window and watched the colony grow small behind them and then disappear into the dark. Sarafael sat 2 seats away, head leaning against the wall, her eyes closed, not asleep, just resting, just letting the tension of 9 days begin slowly to release. Una Park sat across from Ethan and drank something hot from a flask and looked at him the way she had always looked at him, like she was reading a chart and had found an interesting result. She followed you to a viral outbreak, Una said quietly so only he could hear. She followed herself. Ethan said, I didn't ask her to come. I know that's what I mean. Una took another sip. You didn't ask her. She came anyway. That's different from following orders. That's choosing. Ethan looked out the window at the stars. She's a princess. He said she was probably just being responsible. Una looked at him for a long moment. Ethan, my love, you can diagnose cross-speed organ failure from a scan. Readings of 40 seconds, but you have always been completely hopeless at reading a room. Snorts. He didn't answer. She smiled into her flask. Imperial Council's hearing was scheduled for 3 days after their return was to be a formal session. The Shadow Compact's legal challenge laid out before the full council, arguments presented, a ruling made. Depending on the ruling, the Velcro Accord's application to Ethan would either stand or be annulled. The Galaxy's press networks had picked up the story by now. Broadcasts on a dozen worlds were running daily coverage. Question of a human bonded to the Velthari imperial house had become somehow the most watched political story in the sector. Ambassador Chen Wei briefed Ethan the morning before the hearing. He sat across from Ethan in a small office and laid out the situation with the careful precision of a man who had spent his career choosing words like a surgeon chooses instruments. The compact has 43 signatures, Chen said. Their legal argument is strong on technical grounds. The Accord's language is old and it genuinely does not specify cross-species application. He paused. Our legal team believes the council could rule either way. What does the Emperor think? Ethan asked. The Emperor has not spoken publicly since the Compact filed their challenge, chin. Folded his hands on the table. That silence is itself a message, it's not. Clear which message? Ethan nodded. Slowly, and Seraphil Chin was quiet for a moment. She has not been consulted. Officially, the council's process does not require her input, he said it. Carefully without editorializing, but the care itself was editorial enough. Ethan stood up. Thank you, Ambassador. Ethan, Chen stopped him at the door. Whatever happens in there, what you did on KTH-7, you've done in this city, the clinic, the Anshore, none of that disappears whatever they rule. Ethan looked at him. I know, he said, that was never the point. He went to find Seraphil. He found her in the palace gardens, a long space full of the strange plants that grew on Vailthar Prime, their leaves wide and dark, flowers giving off a faint silver light. Even in daytime, she was sitting on a low stone bench, not reading, not working, just sitting, which was unusual. Enough for her that he stopped. When he saw it, he sat down beside her. They were quiet for a while. The garden was calm. Somewhere above them, the three moons of Valar Prime were crossing the sky in their slow, overlapping paths, visible even now as pale shapes against the blue. I want to ask you something, Ethan said, and I want you to answer honestly, not politically, formally. She looked at him. All right, if the council rules against the accord tomorrow, if they annul the bond and I go back to my exchange position and everything goes back to what it was, what happens to you? She was quiet for a moment. There are 3 other noble houses, she said, who have been waiting for years for a formal bonding arrangement with the imperial family. My father has held them off. If the accord is annulled, that reason to hold them off is gone. She paused. I would be matched by tradition, by necessity, by the kind of political logic that doesn't ask what I want. With someone you didn't choose, Ethan said. With someone the court chose, she said. Which is different. Ethan looked at the garden. A small silver-leaved bird landed on a branch nearby, regarded them both with enormous calm eyes, flew away. I'm going to say something, he said, and I need you to know it has nothing to do with the accord or the law, anything that's been decided for us by anyone else. She turned to face him fully. I like talking to you, he said. I like your questions. I like that you corrected my vilely terminology on the second day and didn't apologize for it. I like that you got on a transport to a viral outbreak without asking anyone's permission. I like that you sat on an overturned crate in a supply room and asked me about grief like it was something worth understanding. He paused. I'm not good at this kind of conversation. I'm better at organ failure, but I wanted to say that before tomorrow while it was still my own choice to say it. Seraphil looked at him for a long time. You are correct, she said finally, that you are better at organ failure. He almost laughed. It surprised him, a real laugh, short and genuine. She was almost smiling. I like your questions too, she said quietly, and your stubbornness and the way you answer frightened patients 3 times over without frustration. She looked at her hands. I was prepared to resent you. I had decided before I met you exactly what you would be, a symbol of something imposed on me, something to manage and tolerate. I was wrong. She looked up. I am not often wrong. I find I do not mind being wrong about this. The garden was very still. Whatever they rule tomorrow, she said, I want you to know that too. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Ethan sat in The observer gallery with Ambassador Chen and Yuna, who had stayed on. Veilthar Prime because she said she wanted to see how it ended, and also because the Veilthari food was excellent. Below them the Imperial Council sat in their formal arc, 41 members in deep blue robes. The Shadow Compact's representatives presented their case clearly and with precision. The legal arguments were sound. The technical reading of the accords language was accurate. When they finished, Chancellor Draven spoke in support of the challenge. His voice was level, his argument elegant. He was very good at his work. Ethan watched him and felt no anger, just the calm attention he brought to any complicated situation. Then the Emperor stood. The hall went completely quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting, the deep, absolute quiet of a room that has suddenly understood something is happening that it will remember for a long time. Emperor Velos the Undying did not speak about the accord. He did not address the legal arguments. He did not mention the language of ancient texts or the traditions of 10,000 years. He spoke about what he had seen. He spoke about a man who had operated on his daughter with simple instruments, while more advanced equipment failed. He spoke about a clinic in the diplomatic quarter that had grown too large for its room because people kept coming. He spoke about a trial, the Anshar, where a human had refused to be defined by someone else's terms and had one on his own. He spoke about a report delivered quietly to his son before a journey to a viral outbreak that had saved the Emperor's life without the man who wrote it ever mentioning it, ever using it, ever asking for anything in return. He spoke about Cath 7, about 9 days, about 200 infected and 31 dead, and a pathogen that had been stopped before it reached 12,000 people. He spoke slowly. He chose every word. I did not honor the Velcroth accord because tradition required it, the Emperor said, and the translator's voice carried it through the hall in flat, careful English. I honored it because I looked at the man who was being honored, and I found that tradition for once in my long life had gotten something exactly right. The council was still. The bond stands, the Emperor said, because of law, because the Empire chooses to honor what is worth honoring. He sat down. Draven did not move. The Shadow Compact's representatives looked at each other. 41 council members conferred in murmurs. The ruling came in 11 minutes. The bond stood. Ethan was still sitting in the observer gallery when Saraphael walked in. She had not been in the hall during the hearing. She had been waiting somewhere else, and now she crossed the gallery with the straight-backed, unhurried stride of a woman who had made a decision and was done deliberating. She stopped in front of him. The gallery was still full of people. Chen and Yuna were right there. Various aides and court staff were moving around the edges of the room. None of it seemed to matter to her at all. Come with me, she said. He came with her. She took him to the observation deck of the Mending Hand. It was the ship where they had met, where he had fixed what was broken, where it had all started, and she had arranged access to it without telling him why. The deck was a long room with wide, transparent panels that looked out at open space. The stars were everywhere, still and bright and impossibly numerous. They sat on the floor, which was undignified and also the best way to see the stars from that angle, and they talked for a long time, really. Talked not formally, not about politics, not about law, about things that mattered in the quieter way. She asked him about Earth, about what it looked like from space, about whether humans had always wanted to reach the stars or whether that was something that came later after they had sorted out the things closer to home. He told her honestly that humans had not really sorted out the things closer to home, that they were still working on it, that reaching for the stars had happened alongside everything else, sometimes beautifully and sometimes badly. She found that interesting. She had always assumed, she said, that a species had to achieve a certain level of order before it expanded outward. The Volthari had. They had spent 3,000 years in internal order before their first deep space mission, and look how long it took you to get here, Ethan said, not unkindly. She considered that, and humans simply went, she said. Humans simply went, he agreed, broken pieces and all. She was quiet for a while after that. Then she asked him what humans believed happened after death. She asked it simply, genuinely, not as a philosophical debate but as a real question, the kind of person asks when they have been close to dying and it has left a residue. He thought about it seriously. He took his time. We don't agree, he said. There are a lot of different answers. Some believe in something after, some don't. Some are not sure and have decided that not being sure is okay. He paused. But most of us, I think, whatever we believe about after, most of us decide to make the time we have matter, not because we know what comes next, just because the time is there and the people in it are real. He looked at the stars. That's kind of our whole thing. Make it matter while you have it. Seraphil was quiet. For a long time the stars moved. They always moved slowly. When you watch long enough, the ships drift, carrying them across the view in a gentle, endless arc. Yes, she said finally. Her voice was soft, not sad, something else, something that had arrived after a long journey. I think I am beginning to understand that. Ethan looked at her. She was looking at the stars, her face calm and open in a way it almost never was in public, without the careful composure of a princess, without the sharp attention of a politician, just a person looking at the universe, deciding something. He looked back at the stars too. They sat there for a long time, not solving anything, not performing anything, just two people on the floor of an observation deck, watching the stars go past in no hurry at all. Later, much later, when the story was told and retold across a dozen worlds in Velthari court histories and human news archives, in the kind of informal retellings that happen between people who want to explain something they find hard to explain, someone always asks the same question: what was it really? What was it that changed everything? Not the surgery, not the law, not the trial or the outbreak or the political maneuvering or the emperor's speech. It was smaller than any of that. It was a doctor who did not know how to leave broken things alone, who answered frightened patients 3 times over without frustration, who wrote a report and gave it away without asking for credit, who sat on an overturned crate at 3:00 a.m. and said simply that enough was not a word he knew. The Velthari had built an empire across 1,000 years, reaching across stars, governing a civilization that had never found anything quite like itself in the universe. Humanity had barely reached the stars. They were young and loud and frequently chaotic and still working out problems they should probably have solved centuries ago. And yet a doctor with a scalpel and a refusal to quit had done what no fleet had done, what no treaty had managed, what no diplomatic summit had achieved in 2 years of careful, polite, meaningless cooperation. He had made them wonder, made them look at this small, short-lived, stubborn species and think quietly in the way important thoughts arrived, that perhaps the universe was stranger than they had believed and better, considerably better. The stars outside the observation deck shone on the way stars do, steady and indifferent and beautiful, burning across distances too large for either species to fully comprehend, illuminating everything and explaining nothing. That was all right. Some things do not need explaining, some things just need to